transition. The topic, okay. The topic, as you know, I hope, it's delivering a gender-responsive, just transition. Those of you who follow the gender discussions in the context of the COP will remember that last year there was a decision taken by COP26 for the ILO to produce a report on what it means to have a gender-responsive, just transition. So that was a major breakthrough. I will share some of the main messages from that report, and I will immediately introduce our excellent panel. The policy brief reminds us about the why, and I think we all can agree why we need to have a gender-responsive, just transition. Because we know that women are still faced with higher levels of unemployment and exclusion from the labor market. They are more exposed to changes related to resulting from climate change. So unless we have a proactive approach to promote a gender transformative, just transition, they will be among the losers of the process and not about the winners. So I think I don't need to insist to this group of converted colleagues on the why, but I think that the challenge today is to discuss the how. And for that we have the excellent panel that is joining us. We will do as follows. We have prepared two rounds of questions for each of them. I will kindly ask you to stick to 4 minutes, if possible, to each of those questions. I hope that at the end we might also have a bit of time for questions from the floor. We are also, which is why we are a bit delayed, we are trying to come up in the live stream also with international sign interpretation and closed captioning. I'm not a gender expert in the ILO, I'm a disability specialist, and you will not be surprised to hear that we try from a disability perspective to ensure that all discussions within COP27 are held in an accessible way. And international sign interpretation is one of those things. I hope the live stream will show that, and hopefully it will also show closed captioning. But it's the first time we're doing that, so let's hope. Fingers are crossed. Let me then introduce to you the 5 members of our panel. We have Carmen López Clavero, half Spanish, half Swedish. So she is first secretary at the Swedish Embassy in Jordan, where she leads the Environment and Climate Change team in the Regional Development Cooperation section. Carmen, welcome. From the EU, we have Katharina Wiese, who works for the European Environmental Bureau as Senior Policy Officer for Economic Transition and Gender Equality. From the US, we are joined by Agnes Windblad, Policy Manager, Environment and Sustainable Development from the US Council for International Business, our counterpart from the employer side in the US. From Nigeria, we have here today with us Hawa Mustafa, who is a coordinator on climate change and a senior research officer. And Hawa, I've been told that you're currently working with trade unions in Nigeria to develop a just transition strategic plan that is sector specific. And finally, we have Faith Natalia Saningo, scientist born and raised in a rural Maasai indigenous community in Transmara Narok County of Kenya, who is currently working as program officer at the Olorokuti Resource and Knowledge Center in Kilgoris, Kenya. Did I get it right? Welcome to all of you. Let me now sit down and I'll start with the round of questions. Carmen, I will start with you. Can you share with us CEDA's views on what a gender-responsive just transition is?
Yeah, thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you very much for inviting the Swedish Development Corporation to this panel and to discuss and with my colleagues here into this highly relevant topic. It is increasingly recognized that current economic growth is environmentally unsustainable, and that reducing the resilience of our planet ecosystems drives climate change. We also see from the ILO reporting that you alluded that as much as 40%, so 40% of the global labor force are dependent on the ecosystem services and are at serious risk due to global warming and environmental degradation. The impact of climate change and related economic losses are most strongly felt by those who are already vulnerable. As we were talking about of the framing and that you introduced in this panel, women continue to face exclusion, discrimination, and disproportionate exposure to socioeconomic vulnerabilities, and climate change only exacerbates these challenges and widens the gender inequality gaps. But let me mention, the Swedish Development Corporation takes as its starting point a perspective of people living in poverty and the rights perspective. We also look at three thematic cross-cutting perspectives, namely gender equality, environment and climate, and conflict perspective in all of the work that we do. And you were talking about the how, so that's how we do it. But we also take a multidimensional poverty perspective. And we also not talk about poverty in terms of lack of resources, but also lack of power, voice, and respect for human rights, but also the lack of opportunities, choice, and the lack of human security. But having said this, it is evident the transition to an environmentally sustainable development, which is inclusive of men and women, boys and girls, ensuring access to resources, power, voice, opportunities, choice, and security. It is very much in line of supporting this gender-responsive just transition. It is at the heart of what the Swedish Development Corporation is. So what we see is that gender-responsive just transition needs to go beyond identifying the impact on the transition on women and men, and also only on women, but that we need to redefine what it actually means a just transition for women and men and girls and boys, and realizing the potential of women as agents of positive change in this transition. We see that the prerequisite of this gender-responsive just transition is a gender-responsive leadership. And we see some leaders around this panel. In our view, it means that leadership, it enables, it drives gender equality through the design of programs, policies, and targeting transition. But we see that also is necessary in this leadership, the resources necessary to ensure the gender responsiveness. We also acknowledge the importance of empowering women in the public arena and in decision-making and policy development. And only to conclude in this introductory remarks, we see that women in all their diversity offer the wonderful avenue for positive change and agency, and we see that they are a way to help, or we are a way to help towards a just transition. Thanks.
Thank you, Carmen. A gender transformative just transition, I think, is a better just transition for everybody. Thank you. Katharina, over to you now. Often when we discuss just transition, we think about sectors that are usually male-dominated. Yet there are great potentials for green jobs in other sectors, and the challenge is to widen the understanding of the concept of just transition and ensure that both women and men have equal access to the opportunities that these sectoral labor markets provide. How, in your opinion, could this be done?
Thank you very much. Thanks also for inviting me and having me. Yes, correct. I'm from Brussels and I'm working in the EU sphere. And in the EU, we have quite a narrow approach towards the just transition. So it's really focused on high polluting sectors in certain regions. And where this is, of course, important, it's really necessary, as you said, that we broaden our understanding. Because at the moment, many understand green jobs or sustainable jobs as jobs limited to environmental management, energy efficiency, energy agriculture. But in these industries, in Europe and I think also worldwide, there are mostly men working there. So I think in the renewable energy sector, still in Europe, 30% only women working in the sector, and also not necessarily in the decision-making processes. So what can we do or what can be done? I think what we advocate for is that we need a bit of a deeper analysis who else might actually benefit from a just transition. And here I'm thinking about typically female-dominated sectors such as care and education that could be included in our just transition approach. So first of all, when I think about care, care needs to be more equally distributed in our societies. And also, if we include it in a just transition, it should have the same working conditions, because what we see right now is that this care is highly, poor working conditions, underpaid, etc. So how can we ensure fair pay, good working conditions, etc.? And then why should we include them in a just transition approach in the first place? Because given their high labor intensity, they could be framed as low carbon because they don't require so many materials. And second of all, they contribute largely to the well-being and resilience of our societies, and we know that climate change will put additional pressure on our health and care systems. And education, I think, is also a good example, because it's decisive for our society and for long-term sustainability to equip future generations with the knowledge and the tools and the skills to actually adapt effectively to climate change or other environmental habits. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katharina. Let me now move to the social partners, as we call them in the ILO. And an ILO event without social partners is not an ILO event. So Agnes, first to you. How do we ensure that a gender-responsive just transition takes a multi-stakeholder approach and gender-specific policies are actually included within just transition plans and strategies?
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really thrilled to be here. And yeah, that's an excellent question. And I do want to really emphasize just how imperative it really is in achieving a truly genuine just transition. There is no just transition without looking at the gender imperative. There is no just transition without fully including women, and especially women in the global south. First, I would just like to yet again underscore that the very meaning of just transition implies the absolute necessity to include everyone. It includes youth, it includes children, it includes indigenous peoples, it includes academic institutions, and of course, employers, social actors. It truly includes everyone. Now in adding as well a lens of very critical intersectionality, we further understand that women and girls globally are disproportionately impacted by climate change. This means that we have to pay special attention to how to best include women and girls across all groups and UN constituencies when defining just transition plans and strategies. Ensuring a gender-responsive just transition means looking towards the needs of women and girls first, again, especially in the global south. Just getting back a bit closer to the question at hand and looking at multi-stakeholder approaches in ensuring the creation of truly gender-responsive just transition policy, I think that the UN's Just Transition Guidelines, which was negotiated in the International Labour Organization, is a very good place to start. These guidelines emphasize the importance of gender, and they emphasize the strong gender dimension of many environmental challenges. That's a direct quote from the guidelines. Gender is also a critical lens for the world of work and employers' organizations such as the United States Council of International Business, where I work, which is the US counterpart of the International Organization of Employers, IOE. The ILO Just Transition Guidelines helped define the concept and process for the UN Just Transition Guidelines. And these ILO guidelines are the results of negotiations between experts that represent over 162 governments, employers, and their associations and unions. Our affiliates, again, the IOE, they were a part of those negotiations. These type of guidelines, the UN Just Transition Guidelines, the ILO Just Transition Guidelines, I think really illustrates that what we need on a global scale is to come together from all constituencies to negotiate and agree on aligned steps to take to ensure the inclusion of women and girls when considering the great challenges we have ahead of us in transitioning our economy towards more sustainable models. And I think that's certainly shown yet again, in the Just Transition Guidelines, because gender is one of the 7 guiding principles that calls for specifically policies and programs to really take into account the strong gender dimension of many environmental challenges, but also opportunities. Just to come to a close, I want to say that from an employer's perspective, this means the encouragement of an investment in specifically targeted reskilling and upskilling opportunities for women to meet the skills that are needed for the green jobs of tomorrow. It means looking towards governments and international financial institutions to ensure continued efforts to formalize informal work, something that's already been brought up from prior speakers. Yeah, I think I'll stop here, but this is a finishing thought. I do really want to emphasize that employers know that we need women to be center in a just transition. We need women globally to be included and provided with opportunities to genuinely and truthfully gain the skills needed to be able to partake in the economy in a formal capacity. Thank you.
Thank you, Agnes. Thank you for referring to the ILO Just Transition Guidelines. In fact, the report that I mentioned at the beginning is spelling out the gender element of the Just Transition Guidelines and really follows the structure of the Just Transition Guidelines and looks into each of the dimensions from a gender perspective. I think a very useful report. Let me now move to Hawa. Hawa, globally, women on average are paid about 20% less than men, while individual characteristics such as education, working time, occupational segregation, skills, or experience explain part of the gender pay gap. A large part is due to discrimination based on one's gender or sex. How do you think this issue could be addressed within the context of just transition?
Thank you very much. I also want to appreciate you for this particular workshop, side event, and also for inviting me here. Now, first of all, we understand that women globally form about 49% of the global population. And at the same time, women suffer multiple kinds of subjugation. They are the poorest of the poor. They are the least educated. And like you said, within the income gap, they are the least on the ladder. In terms of inclusion, in the processes of development, oftentimes women are also left outside. So the process of just transition, therefore, what it means to transform women in terms of education and for it to also make meaning in terms of the gender gap, it means that just transition is not just transition, it's not just transition, it is not justice, it is not proper, it is not correct, it is not right if it does not address the fundamental, the fundamental causes of the gender gap. And in this context, it means that we should go down to understanding what are those cultural and traditional barriers that even stop women from accessing sufficient, adequate education. What are those cultural and traditional as well as political barriers that are also likely to hinder women, to participate effectively in the just transition process? So we need to look at these things and then bring them on and address them adequately. So just transition, therefore, should be transformational in terms of culture. It should be transformational in terms of how we think, how we perceive each other as men, as women, even how women perceive themselves. How are they, what kind of culture, what kind of tradition defines roles for women? And how do those roles also affect or impact of women's access to education? This has to be transformed because it is not just sufficient to say we open opportunities for women to access. It is more important to also remove those obstacles that stand in the way of women accessing those opportunities. And just transition should be able to address those obstacles, remove them, address those obstacles. And when we are addressing these obstacles, it is also very important that these obstacles are traditional and that they are also locational. So such certain obstacles that are found against women in the global south might not necessarily be applicable to the women in the global north. So just transition, therefore, cannot just have a one blanket solution to all the problems. It is important that just transition is also localized. That one, we have a general concept of what just transition is, what we want to achieve, but that in actual practice, we also localize the understanding of just transition. And so for women, the obstacles that will stop women or that will stand against women accessing education or equal pay in the north, in the global north, is not necessarily that of the global south. So we now need to identify these specifics. When we identify these specifics, we also need to identify what kind of solution is tailor-made for the specific situation. And that, for me, is transformation. Transformation is about upturning all those obstacles, reorganizing the system, reorganizing, the thought process, reorganizing the culture, reorganizing the tradition, reorganizing all those historical processes that tend to stand in the way of women achieving equality. Just transition is about equality. Transformationally, it is about equity. Transformationally, it is about reducing gaps between men and women globally. It is also about reducing gaps, not just between the men and the women, it is also about reducing gaps between the global north and the global south. So the women in the global north and the women in the global south should have a sense of equality, should have a sense of equity in terms of access to global resources and global policies. So for me, just transition is therefore something that we need to look at as something that addresses, a transformational issue, something that addresses a historical inequality, something that addresses political obstacles, something that addresses even social inequities within our society. And so for me, this is what it means for us. And once we are able to address that, then of course those opportunities those opportunities become accessible. Because it's one thing to have opportunities, it's another thing to have them accessible, and it is also another thing to be able to afford the access to those opportunities. So access and accessibility and affordability must go together, and just transition must be able to ensure that women all over in the workplaces, and even in the workplaces, the sector-specific situation also have to be looked at. That women, for instance, in the construction facility, what do they need for a just transition is not necessarily what will be required for women in the medical sector, for instance. So we need to, even after looking at it from the global perspective, we also need to localize it in terms of sector-specific needs, sector-specific realities. And so for me, this is what just transition should therefore do. A kind of breaking down, breaking down just transition at every point, at every community, at every sector, in every situation. But that the goal is that at the end of the day, the output should be transformational. Thank you.
Thank you, Hawa. I should have addressed in my opening remarks, but I was a bit in a rush, also the element of intersectionality. We speak about women today, but when you add to the fact of being a woman, you add other elements like having a disability, being of indigenous origin, sexual orientation, additional issues come in. Faith, I'm moving over now to you. Rural and indigenous women are especially vulnerable as they face a range of inequalities, such as the inability to enter the workforce and the burden of family care. What can be done to support their entry into the green economy, labor market sectors? Could you tell us more about your own experience? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, my name is Faith Nata, and I'm from Kenya. I'm really happy to share in this space with all of you. And I come from the Maasai community, and for my people, we are traditionally pastoralists, but with time we've come to settle down, and we have our lands demarcated, and we have also adopted farming as a way of life. But for most of our women and young girls, they're unable to access the land, they're unable to access the resources in these lands. And this is a cultural thing because traditionally we are not allowed to own anything, own property. And so this is a really big challenge because now for our women, the only way to get jobs and to access the green markets is by agriculture. Now that is something what we do. And we are unable to do that because now we can't access these lands to feed our cattle, to grow crops, because now we do planting of different crops in our farm. So we can't do this because culturally we're not allowed to. And growing up for my people also, we haven't really accessed education, and that's also a big challenge. And also other amenities. Women are very hardworking, but some of these social amenities and such as healthcare, for example, is very important for them to actually find time to focus on getting jobs and, developing their skills enough to, be able to fit in the markets. So that's also really a very big challenge that, as has been said here, needs to be addressed for women to, find time and be able to access the job markets. Now, for the youth, for example, for our organization, we have had to, because now some of them have really gone to school and are unable to still get jobs, to still get equal pay, just as has been spoken about here. So our organization has taken up the indigenous youths that have done whatever it is that they have learned, at least in school, and use their skills to empower the women in the community, empower fellow youths to be able to access education, because this is going to be important for their future to also get jobs in the future. So the youth have been able to, because for example myself, I did chemistry, and I'm doing now community development, and I'm loving it, and I know my skills are useful for my people. So we're trying to ensure that for all the youths also, especially the girls, because now we have 13 and we're looking to add more and more to have them, to empower them and see how we're able to change this for our community. And so, as has been said, just transition is not just going to be just if we are not having the women and the younger youths. And so we are trying to also see that this is sustainable for the near future. So we are trying to also ensure that the youth are brought on board, and to also have children, once they get education from an earlier age, they're able to know that this is also a space they can take part in, and they're able to get jobs, and they can fight for what is right for them. So I think those are very important aspects, and to also encourage the women already in these spaces, so that the younger generation can learn from what they can see, and to appreciate that this is something that they could also own, and not to continue the cultural, way of how we've been doing things. So thank you.
Thank you, Faith. A good example of what Howard was saying in terms of localization of solutions. Let me now move to the second round of questions. I will follow the same order. So Carmen, over to you. Can you tell us a bit more about CEDA's work to support a gender-responsive transition, and if there are any concrete examples that you would like to share with us?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I want to sort of refer back to what I was mentioning before. So in all of our work at the Swedish Development Corporation, we try to integrate the cross-cutting perspective. So that's why it's at the core of what we do, the gender equality, environment and climate, and the conflict perspective. But alluding to your question, and I think to our colleague and friend from Nigeria, how to address the hinders and obstacles, I think that's what we're trying to do with the Development Corporation. And some examples of that, and I was thinking, because today is the Agricultural Day, it was also pertinent to talk about such examples. So one of the things that we're doing is supporting and focusing on eliminating gender inequalities and to contribute to inclusive social, economic, and biodiversity policies, programming, and approaches. This includes, for example, to address women's primary role in land and biodiversity and natural resource management, and enhancing the understanding of women's role and capacities in biodiversity and sustainable agriculture. And that's one of the things that we do, is focusing on women's farmers. So one example is that we support a program to accelerate progress towards economic empowerment of rural women, and in this, implementing in a collaborative effort with the FAO, IFAD, and WFP and UN Women. And the main objective of this program, it's a global program, and the objective is to evolve around improvements in food security and livelihoods for women's farmers. And it works at a global level, as I said, in Ethiopia, Guatemala, Kyrgyzstan, Liberia, Nepal, and Rwanda. But something that we do, and I think some of my colleagues in the panel were alluding, and one of the things that we're trying to do is addressing access to skills. So the access that you were referring, both of you were referring to, and skills development and capacity building is an area that Swedish Development Corporation focuses on, and in leadership skills, technical trainings. But also something that I think our colleague from the EU was talking about is focusing on traditional agriculture and blending it with new green technology and ICT and digitalization. So I think one of the things that we're trying to do is also stimulating women in green entrepreneurship and green technology, including digitalization and creating job market opportunities related to biodiversity. But at the global level, and as we are in the Just Transition Pavilion, I should reference also to the global support that we're giving to the ILO and the soft earmarking areas around gender equality and non-discrimination, just transition, and environmental sustainability. Conflict perspective is a good example, and this panel is also a good example of the way how we're supporting and shifting the needle and helping to shift the discourse, also to move the needle a little bit more to important topics like we're discussing today. But something that I think we were talking about earlier is also focusing on and I think our colleague from the US were talking about the potential partnership and fomenting and promoting partnerships across the different stakeholders. So we're trying to promote, and we're driving behind a number of collaborations between the public, private, CSOs, and research, because we see that we cannot do it all alone, and to ensure this gender responsive just transition, we need all of us together and in partnership. So we see that this is something that we can contribute as a donor. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen. And of course, many thanks for the support that CEDA is providing to the work that the ILO is doing on gender. Katarina, you mentioned before already in your first intervention, you mentioned care. So let me go a bit more into that. Climate change can have implications on the increase in unpaid care work, mainly performed by women. In your views, how are these two factors interconnected, and how do we ensure that efforts are made towards recognizing unpaid care work in the context of climate change?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, as I also previously mentioned, climate change puts additional stress on our care and healthcare system. In addition to the stress it already puts due to the aging population, at least in Europe or some Western countries. And this is because of the increase of zoonotic diseases, for example, but also with temperature rises, there's more dehydration, etc., etc. But at the same time, it intensifies also the work, such as caring for people, for planet, for animals, etc. And this is, it often reduces the availability and also quality of public services. So what we, for example, seen in studies in Europe is when austerity kicks in and certain public services fall back, then it's like up to the woman to take on this work. And this could also happen in the context of climate change. As we already all mentioned here, that women are still most responsible for the care work, sadly. Yet, I feel that when we talk about climate action, the focus has been largely on women's economic empowerment, opposed to alleviating or transforming existing distribution of care. And our colleague from Nigeria also mentioned the barriers or the stereotypes that we have to that we have to overcome. And why is that? It is because care, and this is paid care work, but also unpaid care work, as you mentioned in your question, is still unrecognized and undervalued in our economy that is based on the extraction and also exploitation of people and planet. So I think what we see right now is that our economic system is kind of divided in two phases. So we have the productive sphere where our goods and services are traded, and then we have the maintenance sphere, which is like caring and economic in environmental processes, which are very, very essential for maintaining the productive sphere. So we have to overcome this and actually put care more into the center of economy. And you also, Carmen also mentioned the need for transforming our economic system. So I think what we need is, first of all, also more research into the interconnection between care and climate change. Then we need climate intervention that are more care sensitive. So we need to accept the fact that care is a foundation of our society, as I mentioned before, like putting care into the center. If we talk about more new technologies of physical infrastructure for care, I think this is not enough. So we need also measures that distribute work more evenly in our societies and overcome the barriers. And I think also what is really important, also mentioned by our colleagues from before, the participation of women in these processes. I don't know how it is with this COP, but I think it's also mind-blowing for me that I think the last COP, only 30% of the climate negotiators were women, and women are largely impacted or over proportionally impacted by climate change. So really, I think we need recognition and also participation of women in these processes, and we really need to speed up this. Yes, I think I will leave it here. Thanks.
Thank you, Katharina. Participation, of course, but also leadership, as you already mentioned before. Agnes, on the leadership issue, what more can employers do to promote women's leadership as well as their role as agents of change on the road to a just transition?
Thank you. So first, I want to start by saying that we need to continue showing up for these type of conversations. They're extremely valuable and absolutely critical in understanding how to tackle such a complex issue as ensuring a gender-just transition. And I also wanted to say that I'm a firm believer in the notion of nothing about us without us. And that's why I feel immensely privileged to be seated between two experts, Hawa and Faith, because they are both experts in their own lived experiences. That's something that I can never speak to. And that's knowledge that is absolutely invaluable for me to hear and to have with me, and for all of us to hear and to have with us. So to really recognize that lived experience is an expertise that no one can take away. I think it's really critical, specifically when we talk about just transition in the context of gender responsiveness, because yeah, that's truly everything. So truly thank you for your very, very valuable contributions there. So yeah, on that notion, I could also say that we need to ensure that we listen to women, and overarchingly that we really specifically listen to women of the global south. Again, I think ILO and for us, IOE provides very critical for us to engage in those conversations. We need to listen to women of intersecting personalities and experiences. This is critical to ensure that we as employers are being meaningfully responsive in our measures to promote women's leadership, especially when we're talking about just transition. We need to encourage and invest in programs providing diverse education, training, and skills development options needed for women to move from, again, informal work to gainful paid employment. And it's critical that we ensure that these skills are relevant to our future green economy. And again, to Hawa's point, what that looks like depends very heavily on the local contexts. And that's something we need to be considerate of. We also need to encourage entrepreneurship skills among women and providing them sufficient infrastructure and support mechanisms. Measures such as easier access to finance through subsidized loans, management and technical training, business consultations. And I think, again, specifically to just emphasize supporting in any way that we can the move from informal economy to formalized economy is truly very, very critical in these conversations. And just as a final thought, I could say that climate change is indeed disproportionately affecting the most vulnerable women around the world. And again, women are overrepresented in the lowest paid and informal jobs. And these are also the jobs that are at the greatest risk from our changing climate. So as more and more companies announce ambitious climate commitments, there is an opportunity to recognize the intersecting areas of gender and climate, and also to raise our own ambitions on both women's economic empowerment and how they are truly tied to climate and environmental outcomes. So yeah, by raising our ambitions on ensuring a truly gender-responsive just transition, we will also inevitably gain a far more resilient and future-proof economy across the board. Thank you.
Thank you, Agnes. I hope everybody could hear in this noisy environment that we are here. Howard, you already mentioned in your first intervention the social cultural barriers that are faced by women and that need to be addressed. Can you tell us a bit more how in practice just transition can address these barriers, and perhaps give us some example of these transformative changes?
First of all, it's important that we speak the language of the women with respect to just transition. In this context, the language of the women with respect to just transition is for them to understand that where they are, their position today, which is not so favorable, which is so much about poverty, which is so much about exclusion, low pay, low education, low opportunities, and so on, can be transformed, can shift to a better position of better pay, better jobs, and so on and so forth. And once they understand that language, that where they are today can shift to a better tomorrow, that is just transition for the women. Now, having said that, the next thing is that you need to bring the women to be part of the process of designing, the program of just transition, and make them to own the process, make them to understand the process, make them to go through the challenges and collectively provide solutions for those challenges. Women need to be part of the whole process. Women need to feel that they belong. Women need to own it. Women need to design it. Women need to, it has to be, the whole process has to be not so pro-feminine, pro-women, in terms of processes of implementation and in terms of outcome. In the case of, in some of the examples of some of the things we've been doing, for instance, in Nigeria, is to first of all make sure that the women, first of all, have the basic knowledge. We sometimes may want to overestimate the knowledge on climate change, which is the starting point. And I may just want to jump into just transition, because just transition is about the process of shifting away from a current carbon economy to a low carbon economy. They need to understand that language. And they need to understand it, contextualize it within what they know, where they function. If it is women in agriculture, for instance, they need to understand climate change within that context, and therefore just transition within the context of what they are doing, what they know, what they already know, and what they already feel. For women in the energy sector, the same thing. They need to understand what it means, where we are coming from, the road to just transition. Just transition is a response, is a journey away from certain place that we are in. So they need to understand where they are. They need to understand the whole concept. They need to understand the language. And once they understand the language and they see the future together with you, they understand the future that they are going for, that is coming away from today, and they see the prospects in that future, then it becomes easier for them to look up to that future. A woman who is in the agriculture sector, for instance, who is using rudimentary techniques for agriculture and is having very little yield. And who tells you, because some of the stories that we hear of the experiences we've had, who tells you that, look, over the years, I'm doing more work, I'm working harder, but I'm getting lower yield. Needs to understand what is happening. How come she's getting lower yield on the same soil or within the same environment? Once she understands it, nobody loves poverty. Nobody wants to remain in a situation of subjugation. Nobody wants to remain weak. Everybody looks up to the good life. And so she sees and understands that this position where she is, there can be something that can be better from where she is. Of course, she will embrace it. And that is, if the same thing goes to people in the energy sector. Part of the challenges we are having in a place like Nigeria, and indeed in Africa generally, is that, of course, we even know that universally, change is one of the most, challenging things for any human being to embrace, even where you know that this current situation is not too good. Once you are skeptical of what is to come, you are not sure about it, you are very slow and reluctant to shift towards what you don't know. So they need to understand. And I think that is why oftentimes one of the things that is lacking is people also need to see best practices. Women also need to see best practices. So they need to see where some of these changes you're talking to them about has occurred, where people who were once in their own position have embraced the new life, the new strategy, the new method, and it has worked for them. Once they are able to see that, they will quickly embrace it, because the most important thing about transition for the women to understand, for them to be carried along, is to let them understand that the future is a better future than where you are today. And once you are able to demonstrate that, once you are able to convince them to do that, it becomes very easy for them to tag along.
Thanks a lot, Hawa. As you all know, one of the work streams of the COP is action for climate empowerment. No? Really making sure that everybody understands the issues, which is not something we can take for granted. And I think particular attention needs to be given to what you just said, to just transition, to gender equality. People need to have a better understanding, and target groups need to be identified for that to happen. Because if people don't understand what is at stake for them, it's very difficult to expect them then to actively participate. Faith, last question to you. Women, girls, and other vulnerable groups should play a leadership role as climate change continues to have a greater impact on those more reliant on natural resources to support their livelihoods. How can we help them do that?
Thank you again. So, for our communities and back at home, as I said, culturally we have so many challenges, and to break this, there has been a lot of education and strengthening capacity of the women to understand that we can move from that, to have a better way of life for them and their kids. And this has been very important for the women to understand, that they can be leaders right from their homes, because they've been actually doing this, you're deciding what kind of food you want to cook for your families. And they have been doing the little things, they've been deciding the little things, but we wanted them to understand that they can scale this up, because now they have, they're organized in groups and they can take up leadership roles, like, from the family level to the small group levels, and then to the community level, and finally to the national and internationals. And we're very impressed at how they're taking this up, and we even brought some of the women here to the conference, to continue learning and to see that women are able to, achieve, and they're able to take up these spaces, and they're able to make change. And that has been a very big, has made a very big difference for the women in our community. So, and I'm sure if after this, when they share what they have learned, because one of our biggest way to, demonstrate and help the women learn is by knowledge exchanges. And, after they have shared this knowledge, they're able to take up that in their own ways, to implement that in their communities and their families, and that makes a big difference for all of us. One of the other things, to to make the women take up these leadership roles is to appreciate what they're doing, the little things, because all the small changes leads up to the big, actions that we want to see. And so appreciating the little things they're doing, appreciating their organizations, appreciating the kind of work they're doing is going to make a very important difference because now the women will be seeing that this is what the women who are leaders are doing, and they're being appreciated for it, and it will encourage even more women to take up these leadership roles and, want to do that for the rest of the community. Also, the community has the few leaders that there are who are women, and we want to ensure that they are empowered more. And we are making the women see that those that are already taking up the spaces are being appreciated, and so they will want to also be a part of that and, want to change this for their families, because, everything is changing, and with all the changes also, the women are being left behind to, take up all the roles in the family. And so we want to help the women do this. And, part of the bigger part is that the women lack knowledge on the small, on their rights, for example, and we want to impact this for them so that they're able to act and get what they want. Because now for the few women leaders that we have, for the many challenges that they've had and going through the education, they were able to share their stories. And for example, for our communities, when the man, dies, the women is supposed to take up the role of being a leader for the rest of the family. But that does not happen, because now if you have a brother to your husband who's still alive, your older child, they will take up everything, take up your land and property. And no matter the business that you do, the money that you get, they will still take that from you. And so we've tried to train the women, and now they're sharing their stories of how this has changed for them and how they're able to sustainably take care of their families long after the many changes are occurring. And so we want to empower the women to also do that, and to also invest in the small businesses that they're already doing. And for climate finance, to also make a way to have finance directed to this women-led organization, so that they're able to also scale up the small activities that they're doing in the community and the grassroots. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Faith. Colleagues, I think we are coming slowly to the end of the side event. A side event on which we are focused on two important issues: gender equality and just transition. Two issues that sometimes risk to be less visible from one COP to the other. It seems always there's a bit of a challenge of maintaining the attention to it. Last year there was a decision which led to the report I mentioned before. This year again, the gender mainstream is discussing a follow-up discussion, but there is some backlash there. Not everybody is equally convinced. So we can't relax on this issue. We need to continue insisting that these issues are mentioned in every of the elements, in mitigation, adaptation, in loss and damage, in empowerment for climate change. We need to make sure that these issues are not sidelined by other issues. I don't think we will have time to allow for questions from the floor, but I'm looking to the panel. Is there one message, one line, final takeaway that you would like to leave the colleagues in the room and those that are watching us on live stream online now, or perhaps later on? Any sort of one-line final takeaway message that you would like to share with them? Let me start with you.
Yeah, finally, gender equality is about women's empowerment. It's about understanding the cultural differences or the cultural processes that define a woman separately from defining a man, and how these collectively affect women's access to opportunities and to facilities. To enable these, I think final word is to say that it's important that women are given special opportunity within the broad opportunity, in terms of credit facilities, in terms of access to skills and training, in terms of social protection, in terms of education, in terms of even the policy processes. And like you rightly said, gender should not always just stand on its own. aside from gender standing as a one separate chapter or issue, it is more important that gender also is mainstreamed in every other policy. So we want to see it in social protection. We want to see gender in loss and damage, like you said. We want to see it in climate finance. We want to see it in every aspect of policy and program that concerns humanity with respect to just transition. Thank you.
Thank you. No, oh, don't worry. Thank you, Hawa. I think my final message is truly just to listen to women and include women in the processes at all times, and to understand that women can't ever be removed from the conversation of just transition, because without the full inclusion of gender considerations and of women empowerment, there is no just transition. Thank you.
My final word will be that indigenous women at the local communities, they have the knowledge. They know so much, and they should be treated as such, and they can make very important contributions, and therefore their effective and meaningful participation at all levels should be encouraged. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I want to reiterate my earlier point about that we need to redefine what just transition means for women and men and boys and girls alike, and realizing the potential of women as agents of positive change in this transition. So thank you.
Yes, I think I had a few thoughts in my mind. So one is like, I think we need role models. So let's talk to each other, let's inspire others. And the other one is like also getting together, showing solidarity with each other, because I think what I sometimes see in feminist movements that we actually want the same, but then we are not working together. And another one is also just reiterating, okay, care is essential for our society. It's maintaining our society. Let's put this in the core of a just transition. Thanks.
Thank you. Huge thanks to the 5 panelists. I think they deserve a round of applause. Also from, I'm sure the online audience is also applauding, and will be watching this, have been watching live stream, and will also watch it later on recorded. So thank you very much for your time.